the biodata of these speakers is in the pack which was given to you, so I will not go extensively through them when I introduce the speakers. But I'm very happy to have Jem Putzel first as a first speaker, who is here. Yes, exactly, yeah. Behind the computer. I was looking for your name and I could not see you. You were there a moment ago, weren't you?
Yeah, by stealth.
Okay, fine.
By stealth, I came over here.
You come from the London School of Economics, and you have been particularly working on fragile states and crisis situations in development countries over the last years. So we're very happy to listen to you to tell us what we have learned.
Well, thank you very much. And in 10 minutes to talk about 12 years of research is difficult. So I want to make just a few points. I want to thank, first of all, CTA for inviting me. All my career, I worked in agriculture and agrarian change issues until I took up the directorship of a research center called the Crisis States Research Center that was looking at these problems of state fragility, even defining them at the time, right across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, together with partners, research partners in the South. So I have far too many, are my slides going to go up on the screen? Yeah? Okay. I have far too many slides here, so I'm going to flip through them rather quickly. There is a short paper in your pack that's called Responding More Effectively to State Fragility that sums up some of the big overall points. I think I was asked to come here to give some notion of what we've learned about fragility in general. Okay? And so before I, well, if I, oops, I'm told to use this. I mean, the slides will cover this. You can go back and look at them. I think the slides are printed out as well. What I want to say, I think there is a really big point. It's related to the introductory remarks. What we came to find is that state fragility is not the same thing as poverty. It's not equal to underdevelopment in the extreme. And yet, in most of the development agencies, it has been treated this way over time. And I think there are problems related to that. And if I have anything else to say, is that it's meaningful to understand state fragility as vulnerability to violence, and to look at the particularities that are involved in that. When I speak, I'm not speaking just in terms of it's meaningful for donors and aid agencies to look at this way, but for state leaders or those who aspire to state power in developing countries, and so within the ACP countries themselves. So I think that's a really key and important point. I do appreciate that this meeting is looking at what in your own terms are called the most fragile situations, and they more or less correspond to the ones that are most vulnerable to violence from my point of view. And I also especially appreciate that this work is going on around agriculture. Because, you know, from 1980 on, for the next 2 decades, there was a huge decline in aid to productive sectors, and especially to agriculture. And this is beginning to be reversed, but so I think these foci are extremely important. But I want to say if agriculture is part of the solution to state fragility issues, then it needs to take into account what's specific about fragility. Because, of course, agriculture is the solution to development in many places. And there are particular issues related to humanitarian intervention, where agricultural intervention can be important in terms of humanitarian relief. There are particular issues obviously related to climate change, which I think are absolutely central. And there are even issues related to how do you do agriculture within a war situation. So these things are all important, but it doesn't always help to think about them all as one problem, okay? And so state fragility really is related to politics in many ways. And by understanding what drives it, both the internal drivers, and I would argue it's the political organizational issues inside any country that is the biggest driver of fragility, the issue of people being excluded from the settlement behind the state, the issue of people being unequally treated as between ethnicities and regional identity groups. These are the things that really lead to vulnerability to violence. And so agricultural responses need to take account of these issues when they're talking about state fragility. That's really, in sum, what I want to say. But let me kind of quickly go through some of this. So, I mean, obviously, this whole thing emerged on the agenda the whole title of state fragility as a security issue after 9/11. And this made a really important change in the development aid because up until then, most of the focus of development aid agencies was on supporting those who were doing well, those who showed progress in good governance. So aid diminished throughout the 1990s to most sub-Saharan African countries, most of the places that needed it the most. So putting this question on the agenda had a big effect in terms of getting aid directed towards the poorest countries, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and also putting issues of state and state reconstruction back on the development agenda. But I would suggest to you, and a lot of what is in that little paper talks about the problems and the way that fragility has come to be defined. So for many years, the OECD, DAC, defined fragility as basically everything, as extreme underdevelopment. Okay, and that was the definition. I flashed it up on the screen. I don't want to go into this in great detail, but basically fragility was about extreme poverty. It was about countries not able to meet the needs of their citizens, et cetera. But that defines underdevelopment in general. What specifically makes poor countries more susceptible to violence? And it was measured and still is to some extent by the bank, by the CPIA index. I have a whole critique of that. I'd be very happy to go through it in our discussion if you like. But it was thought notionally and then actually embedded in most of the reporting on state fragility that countries that fall below 3.2 on the CPIA index, which was actually devised as a tool, an effective tool actually, for allocating development aid in the IDA at the bank. Anything below 3.2 was a fragile state. And the big problem with this, for instance, is illustrated by Mali. So Mali, for years, fell above 3.2 until the year when Mali collapsed in the face of the uprising and the violence, and the whole northern part of the country was lost to insurgents, okay? And we could talk in more detail during the discussion about Mali. I'll come back to it just really briefly. How many more minutes do I have? 4. Okay, all right. So, big issue is that many poor countries actually have avoided civil war. So more than half the countries in sub-Saharan Africa avoided civil war over time. And let me get beyond this. And if we look at 2 of the countries we studied in great detail were Tanzania and Zambia, very low on the Human Development Index. And still, these scores, if anything, have gotten worse for the countries I've listed here, except for Ghana, which has improved. So the point is that if fragility is not equal to extreme poverty, what is it about? And I think it really is important to recognize that. You can get the interesting thing to ask about Tanzania is not why did it stay so poor for so long, but why was it so peaceful? Why was it so peaceful? And I think we can learn a lot about fragility by looking at what has been resilience. And that's what's been lacking in most of our discussion. Okay? So let me kind of very quickly scroll to the end because I don't have a lot of time. You can look through this and you can ask me questions about it. what does all this mean? Once recognizing that fragility is something distinct, what does it mean in terms of agriculture? Okay, you'll see if you go through my slides that I recognize the OECD has changed its definition of fragility. You at the CTA have been using that new OECD definition, but I would say while it recognizes vulnerability to violence now more than it did before, it's still everything. Everything contributes. There's so many risk factors contributing to fragility that we can fold in everything. So I think there's still a problem in the framework. So if we see that we should move away from this kind of all good things and all bad things go together. If you're poor, you're also extremely poverty-stricken, extremely vulnerable to climate change, et cetera, et cetera. If we move away from these kind of, oops, somebody help me. Okay, there. And we have an idea that there's a different approach to fragility. What came out of our work were that there are four really key dimensions around which fragile countries move more towards fragility and more towards resilience. One has to do with security. The second has to do with the territorial reach of the organizations of the state. The third has to do with the fiscal activity of the state. Not so much how good is the tax take, because that's a developmental issue, but is the state the one who taxes, or are there many sources of taxation? And the other side of the fiscal coin, does the state or aid projects, for instance, spend in ways that reduce horizontal inequalities? In other words, the inequalities that are defined by ethnic group, regional group, or religious group? Or does it increase those inequalities, reinforce those inequalities? And the fourth issue, back to my slides, please, so I can, oh, they're here. Are they here? Sorry. All right, this is coming on to where I want to be anyway. And the fourth dimension of fragility has to do with whether the state's institutions are hegemonic, or are there many different rival rule systems? Because when there are different rival rule systems, that means tribal rules or warlords' rules or religious rules that trump the state's rules, people organize actions, legitimate actions in terms of those rules. So for us, this more parsimonious approach to understanding the spectrum that states move, we shouldn't try to put states in a typology, but are they moving to become more fragile, more resilient? It's around those issues. So what might that mean in relationship to agricultural policy? Okay. So I think this is where, maybe it makes a difference for our discussions today. So this would mean that when allocating state spending, if you are those who are acting in control of the budget of a given developing country, one takes account of the regional pattern of spending on agriculture. When you're thinking about the allocation of aid projects, one looks at, well, in the end, is this allocation reducing or increasing horizontal inequalities? That's the fragility issue about the agricultural projects. There's all sorts of other issues about empowering the poor, reducing vulnerability to climate change, et cetera, that one wants to think about. But that's the issue that provokes vulnerability to violence the most, okay? When we're looking at questions of agricultural and rural policies, for many decades, the discourse has been about integrating into the international economy. The fragility problematic really needs to focus on how do projects, interventions, et cetera, promote internal economic integration. I think that's evident in some of what you've written and some of the projects you're doing from the CTA. So in other words, one's looking at the link between farmers and urban areas. One's looking at the farm-to-market roads, the access to markets, and the balance between production of staples and other commercial crops becomes extremely important here. internal economic integration is the important thing that has, been lacking in many countries that are vulnerable to violence. The third has to do with encouraging state capacity. There's a very big kind of bit of our work that looked at the problem that some others, like the current president, sitting president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, had looked at the problems of creating a dual public authority in the delivery of aid and aid programs. In other words, many donors are going outside state systems to be effective, to get aid right down to the communities. But very often channeling aid that way in the most fragile places creates alternative centers of authority that can challenge and do challenge the state or preempt state systems from developing. So there's a lot of experience of, even with weak states or states that are suffering from fragility, we're working with state systems to deliver programs, getting aid on budget. In the long term, this is going to be very important to countering fragility. And it means that aid and aid projects and agricultural assistance will not always be based on issues of what is most efficient, what is most effective in production and productivity terms. So this is where it makes a real difference to say you're recognizing state fragility. When it comes to land, and a lot of my own work has been on land reform and land redistribution as a matter of both social justice and as a matter of economic development. But land policies and situations of fragility have to consider some other issues. They really have to consider the extent to which there is elite buy-in into the state. So one of the places I've studied a lot is Mindanao in the southern Philippines. And there, the land reform that was being promoted in other parts of the country couldn't be promoted as part of the peace process in Mindanao because it would alienate the Moro elites and contribute to aggravating the continued conflict and war. So issues of land become important on the other side when land was a driving factor for why people took up arms or got into conflict. Then it has to be really at the top of the agenda, even if it means certain ineffective production. And finally, just two other points. Policies related to fragility need to think not only about poverty reduction, but possibilities for wealth creation. If we're going to buy in, if elites are going to buy into the state project, then there has to be concern about how elites across ethnic and identity groups can partake and participate and gain from what you're promoting in agriculture. And in the end, it means that addressing fragility specifically might mean quite a different approach under this SDG 2 in terms of agricultural development than it would mean in general in more resilient places. That's essentially the essence of what I wanted to say.